My name is Michael Leruth. I teach at the College of William and Mary, and I've been interested in the work of Fred Forrest for about 20 years. I'm not an art historian or critic, but work in the field of French cultural studies. My other research interests include the intersection of cultural policy, public culture, and political culture, the French Republican tradition, and representations of French national identity, particularly in national celebrations. I'm also interested in recent intellectual debates about culture in France, including the great debate about contemporary art that the French call la querelle de l'art contemporain, a name that is reminiscent of the famous 17th century quarrel of the ancients and the moderns. In fact, the art debate was to a large extent a quarrel of the moderns and the contemporaries, and Fred Forrest was an important figure in it, as a non-aligned agent provocateur who considered both the moderns and the contemporaries defenders of two only slightly different versions of institutional elitism, one nostalgic, the other hypocritical, and both out of touch with society. So I've always approached Forrest's work from the standpoint of its broader social, cultural, and intellectual significance. I've also collaborated with Fred on a certain number of his projects over the years. The first was the Digital Street Corner, an internet-based participatory event at the Basque Museum of Art in Miami Beach in 2005. Another example of collaboration is Ego Cyberstar and the Problem of Identity, a video installation Fred presented at the Flux Factory in New York in 2010. I voiced the title character, a self-absorbed and anxious man, fed up with life in the real world, who takes refuge in Second Life, only to find profound loneliness and even greater self-doubt. I participated in Fred's retrospective at the Pompidou Center in Paris in the summer of 2017, and my book about Fred's work, Fred Forrest's Utopia, Media, Art, and Activism, was published by MIT Press in September 2017. Like a lot of people, I've always been drawn to Fred's bad boy persona. Fred Forrest is a tenacious rebel, an incurable prankster, a wily pirate, a bit of a charming huckster, and a provocative gadfly. But Fred is no rebel without a cause. He's challenged institutions of power and disrupted business as usual in politics, the media, social life, the economy, and art. He was arrested in Sao Paulo in 1973 and interrogated by the Brazilian military regime's secret police, the DOPS. As a foreigner and an artist, he was treated more gently than a common dissident, but it still took the intervention of the French embassy to secure his release. In 1991, he went to Bulgaria and launched a renegade campaign for the presidency of Bulgarian national television with the help of some liberal journalists and intellectuals. He held press conferences like a serious politician and staged a droll motorcade in the streets of Sofia, the capital. And he nearly persuaded the incumbent to debate him on live television on the merits of his proposals for a more utopian and nervous form of TV, but had to leave the country quickly when sources let it be known that he was no longer welcome. His biggest nemesis was none other than the Pompidou Center, which he sued over the lack of transparency in the institution's acquisitions procedures. He ultimately lost his case on appeal in 1998. The precedent-setting ruling by the Council of State cited the principle of trade secrets and the government's abiding interest in protecting a fragile art market. The publicity generated by the case nonetheless gave Forrest a celebrity's platform on which to denounce the corruption and social insignificance of institutional contemporary art. It also sealed his fate as a persona non grata of the French art establishment. As his counter-exhibition at the White Box proves, Forrest hasn't softened his stance vis-à-vis France's most prestigious institution of modern and contemporary art. In 2012, he also staged a protest performance at the Video Vintage exhibition at the center. He had himself bound from head to toe in vintage Sony Portapak videotape, and then cut free by members of the public to call attention to the exhibition's restrictive view of the history of video art in France, which didn't include him and other pioneering outsiders. Forrest works like a hacker and ought to be considered a major precursor of today's hacktivists and militant culture jammers. He hacks his way into media, art, closed and marginalized social media, and powerful institutions. He makes them do things that they're not supposed to do and reveals their internal contradictions. He uses art, media, politics, and the market against each other for the good of an open and more democratic society. One good example of his hacker tactics used against the art establishment is Biennial of the year 2000. Forrest returned to Sao Paulo in 1975, uninvited to the city's Biennale, to stage an alternative exhibition of his own. It offered a whimsical critique of the official Biennale in real time, in a space adjacent to and hard to distinguish from the official exhibition venue. His trick was to treat the ongoing official exhibition as if it had occurred 25 years prior, and to display documents of it made on the spot as if they were artifacts in an anthropological museum. He also hacked Documenta 8 in Cassel in 1987 to create his force field of 14,000 hertz. Using a press pass to gain access to the exhibition hall, he was again uninvited as an artist. Forrest hid a number of tiny ultrasound transmitters, in reality electronic mosquito-repelling devices. These tiny transmitters created an electromagnetic force field that symbolized the way that money invisibly inundated the art world. The operation was kept secret. It was only revealed after the fact in a press release and an article in a regional newspaper. The article was accompanied by an opinion piece by Forrest on the social responsibility of art, which was one of the themes of the exhibition. For Forrest, this ostentatious commitment to social responsibility was undermined by all of the deal-making that went on behind the scenes. He singled out an anti-apartheid work by the German conceptualist Hans Haacke that had been sold by the Artist Gallery in the context of the exhibition. This didn't necessarily entail a personal attack on Haacke, a respected fellow artist and rigorous social critic, but it clearly suggested that no artist on the market was entirely innocent or uncorrupted by a system that treated transgressive artworks as just another type of luxury goods.
Forrest's career can be divided into three phases. The first is sociological art, from the late 1960s through the 1970s. During this phase, Forrest works a lot with video and stages critical interventions in the mass media and in concrete social situations. The second phase, from the 1980s through the mid-1990s, is associated with the aesthetics of communication. During this phase, Forrest focuses on telecommunications, networks, various types of multimedia hybrids, and game-like simulations. In my book, I describe the third phase of his career, from the mid-1990s through the present, in terms of experiments in cyberliminality. It involves work that makes use of the internet in various ways and often exhibits an explicitly ritual or festive quality.
That Forrest has had such a long and noteworthy career in art at all is remarkable, given the fact that he is a largely self-taught artist. He was born in 1933 in Mascara, French Algeria, where his family operated a hardware store. He was a young adult during the Algerian War and left for France shortly before Algerian independence in 1962. Although he would later receive a doctorate from the Sorbonne and teach at a number of art schools and universities, he first left school after the equivalent of the 8th grade. He worked for the French Postal Service from 1954 to 1971, both in Algeria and later in France. So Fred Forrest is quite literally the postman cheval of contemporary art. He also explains that his first intuition of an aesthetic of communication came to him while working at the post office in Mascara, sorting the mail and playing pranks at the switchboard. He had a measure of success as a painter in the 1950s and 60s, in a style that included both abstract and figurative works. Not content with the static quality of painting, he experimented with what he called tableau écran, the canvases serving as screens onto which images were projected. These screen paintings, or projection paintings, were incorporated in multimedia happenings, including several projects in collaboration with the experimental composer Luc Ferrari. In the early 1970s, Forrest also worked as a political cartoonist, an illustrator for publications like Combat and Les Echos. For the latter, he created Globulus, a cartoon series that related the existential tribulations of a bizarre post-human species of living brains. Forrest claims to have stopped making art in the conventional sense in 1969. This is a bit of an exaggeration. However, there was a distinct sociological turn in his work in the late 1960s that did eventually entail an abandonment of traditional media like painting. Two developments in 1967 played a decisive role in this new orientation. The first was his foray into video art. In 1967, he received one of the first Sony Portapak prototypes, adapted to European technical norms. The same year, he shot his first videos, including The Telephone Booth, which was shot from the window of his apartment in a modest Paris suburb. Influenced by the Nouveau Réaliste and the work of the Marxist sociologist Henri Lefebvre, it's an unedited look at a small slice of everyday life, with the telephone booth as a poetic symbol of isolated individuals' connection to the outside world. In the same year, Forrest also staged his first social intervention as an artist, the family portrait. His objective was to give the residents of a public housing estate agency in the production and projection of their own social image by submitting a family photo for a series of exhibitions and communal gatherings. The participants were in fact his neighbors. The submissions were both charming and poignantly ordinary, and served as a rebuttal of the stereotypes that the French media were already spreading about the denizens of the country's suburban rabbit cage apartment complexes, or HLMs. Forrest's commitment to sociological art developed further through his involvement as one of the founding members of the Sociological Art Collective, along with Hervé Fischer and Jean-Paul Tenot. Theory became increasingly important to Forrest, who defined sociological art as neither art nor sociology, but radical sociological praxis under the cover of art. One could say that 75% of Forrest's artistic DNA comes from sociological art. This includes his view of art as a quasi-scientific research endeavor, his consideration of the artist as a service provider rather than a content provider, his focus on dematerialized works construed as transmedia events in real time, and his insistence that the work is really made by members of the public via their interaction with and through a utopian interface embedded in the everyday environment. Two other collaborators exerted a strong influence on Forrest during his sociological art period. One was Pierre Restany, who was to become a lifelong friend.
Restany considered Forst a worthy heir to the Nouveau Réaliste and to Yves Klein's poetic and spiritual exploration of the void. The other was Willem Flusser, his philosophical mentor, who called him the artist who pokes holes in media, and wrote a number of insightful commentaries on his work. According to Flusser, Forst's use of video exemplified a post-objective and dialogical form of epistemology. As a videographer, Forst didn't stake out a singular, detached, and objective perspective outside of the social situations that he was investigating. He immersed himself in them and playfully interacted with the people he encountered in those situations, encouraging them to question, contrast, and add to the different points of view made available to them by video. In the most complex of these experiments in post-objective social observation, Forst used multiple video circuits to create complex, layered, and crisscrossed feedback loops. The overall effect was of defamiliarization and mise en abîme. Flusser saw this as conducive to the production of new social knowledge and insights. The cumulative effect of the different video mirrors tactically positioned in the field of observation made up for what was lost in the retreat from a grand strategy of objectivity. In electronic investigation of Rue Guénégaud, the two underlying premises of the experiment were nonetheless quite simple. The first was to put the social reality of a Parisian street on display in an art gallery, while simultaneously offering up the scene in the gallery to the scrutiny of passers-by in the street. The second one was to get the people inside the gallery to look at the real-time video feed of the street outside as if it were from the past.
La rue Guénégaud commence au bord de la Seine, au quai Conti. Elle va jusqu'à la rue Mazarine. Elle a très exactement 190 mètres de long, 10 mètres de large. La rue Guénégaud est un lieu d'échange, traversé par des personnes, par des voitures, et elle est tout au bord, au long de ces maisons, suivie par des passants qui passent suivant les numéros 1, 2, 3, etc. On voit des boutiques tout au long de cette rue, et aussi des murs qui portent des inscriptions, des messages, des boîtes aux lettres, et tous ces éléments-là la personnalisent en tant que rue Guénégaud, qui reçoit de le monde extérieur des tas de messages qui sont des emballages, des colis, des lettres, des paquets, des victuailles qui sont consommés, puis qui rejoignent les poubelles de la rue Guénégaud.
Even in his more straightforward documentary-style videos, Forst sought out complex mirror effects. In The Hairdresser's Gestures, the array of mirrors and atmosphere of image-conscious self-observation in the salon made for a particularly fascinating setting for a test case of Forst's dialogical method of observation via video.
Et c'est un métier quand même qui est assez fatigant, il faut rester toute la journée debout, là, qui demande une certaine résistance.
Ah oui, là, vous savez que c'est pas du gâteau, hein. Surtout pour les jambes, hein. Parce qu'on entend trop souvent les gens ici, on se fatigue beaucoup. Parce qu'on tourne autour d'un bateau qui fait quoi, rien du tout comme la journée.
In Video Portrait of the Collector in Real Time, he used the interactive properties and raw realism of video to turn the traditional genre of the artist's flattering portrait of the patron into a means to deconstruct the social ritual of the art auction. The project also offered an ironic perspective on the hyper-competitive nature of the art market. Collecting is a highly evolved form of conspicuous consumption, and the aura of the great collector as a prime mover of the contemporary art scene. The work for sale at the auction being filmed was none other than the film of the auction in progress. While the auction footage ended most fittingly in a triumphal close-up shot of the winning bidder, this climax was offset by the winner's contractual obligation to have himself filmed by the artist on the same tape, eating 3 complete meals.
Oui, ici, 1600.
In other projects, the video content produced or presented in the work was secondary to the social dialogue it facilitated. Video could serve as a pretext to get marginalized groups to interact more freely, as in senior citizen video, or to bring together social groups not accustomed to interacting with one another, as in Sociological Walk in Brooklyn, Madame Soleil in the Flesh, and the Video Family.
Partiront, ceux qui voudront rester resteront, ceux qui voudront s'en aller s'en iront, ceux qui voudront partir partiront. Si les femmes sont belles ici, nous y passerons la nuit. Si les femmes sont belles ici, nous y passerons la nuit.
On one level, the Video Family was a fairly conventional video installation that commented on the prevalence of TV in domestic life. However, it also brought together two distinct groups to encounter the installation at the same time. Average apartment hunters who had responded to a classified ad announcing a viewing of the flat, and bourgeois art aficionados who had received an invitation to attend an opening reception at the same address. By 1980, Forrest had grown tired of the sociological art collective's structure, jargon, and increasingly academic approach to its sociological experiments in the field. He wanted to place greater emphasis on symbols, simulation, and sensory experience in his work. And he had become interested in the broader effects of telecommunications technologies, effects that were not just social and political in nature, but also psychological, cognitive, anthropological, and existential. His solo manifesto in Le Monde in 1980 signaled his desire to take sociological art in these new directions. In 1983, he co-founded a new movement, the Aesthetics of Communication, to promote the use of art as a means to explore how telecommunications altered our perception of the world, upset long-standing spatiotemporal paradigms, and gave rise to a new virtual environment layered over the familiar physical one. Forrest's main partner in the aesthetics of communication endeavor was Mario Costa, a media theorist and professor of aesthetics at the universities of Salerno and Naples. Costa played a key role in the development of such concepts as metacommunication, the aesthetics of flux, and the technological sublime. As practiced by Forrest, metacommunicational art involved revealing things about the so-called immanent realities of communication itself. Whether or not the work also conveyed a coherent message was immaterial. Some of his metacommunicational works resembled Zen koans. They were designed as riddles meant to confound conditional ways of thinking about our experience of reality in the context of electronic media and telecommunications. Others offered poetic and playful sublimation of ordinary interfaces. Immediate intervention is an example of the first type. An ostensibly live Forrest places a call to an art gallery from a telephone booth somewhere off-site, an action visible in real time to the people in the gallery via closed-circuit TV. The call is answered by an assistant, who puts the live but absent Forrest in communication with a pre-recorded Forrest, whose voice emanates from a tape player in plain sight of the public, right next to the monitors. The two avatars of Fred Forrest then proceed to have a nonsensical and out-of-sync conversation with one another about life and death. The live experience in this case can't be described using our familiar frames of reference, presence versus absence, distance versus proximity, past versus present, and so on. Nevertheless, an intervention of poignant immediacy does take place, albeit in some interstitial utopian dimension where different interfaces overlap. Telephonic faucet is an example of the second type of metacommunicational work. Members of the public participated in the experiment by placing a call to a special number. The call, triggered the electronic valve of a faucet that then spewed a small quantity of water into a bucket in the Mole Antonelliana in Turin. That is, until the bucket was full and the water began to overflow onto the marble floors of the historic monument. Though simple in design and whimsical in spirit, this action was also poetic. It brought about an experience of the technological sublime, involving the mysterious sense of connection briefly created between the mutually anonymous callers and visitors to the site. The sense of partial telepresence and nearly magical agency it offered the callers. Its use of water as a metaphor of information flow, and its reference to the interconnectedness of global infrastructures, not to mention collective responsibility for the conservation of natural resources. During the same period of the 1980s, Forrest still remained faithful to the socio-critical imperatives of the sociological art of the 1970s. Some of the most successful works of his entire career were the temporary alternative networks of mass communication he assembled by combining different media in unusual ways. Stock Exchange of the Sensational and Press Conference of Babel both involved the ironic and critical détournement of the news. The exchange was a reflection on the status of the news as a marketable commodity produced in response to public demand. It was also an exercise in community building, based on the sharing of sensational stories that evoked unexpected occurrences of the bizarre, the sordid, the criminal, the tragic, and the serendipitous in everyday life, the raw material of the collective imaginary. Forrest put together his own news-gathering organization using the mail and telephone networks, answering machines, telex and teletext-based telematics technologies, and an on-site staff to assist members of the public in the submission of both real and fake news items in the faits divers genre. At the end of each day, with great fanfare, the items were assigned value and ranked on a simulated exchange.
Nous sommes ici sur la table où les différents participants qui passent dans le centre ont la possibilité de rédiger le fait divers. Ce fait divers va être mis au staff de travail aux fins d'archivage. Vous voyez ici un photocopieur qui va permettre de le multiplier en centaines, en milliers d'exemplaires qui seront eux-mêmes distribués et dans le centre et dans cet espace, mais aussi à l'occasion d'interventions ponctuelles dans Paris. Le staff de travail présent archive tous les documents d'une façon très rigoureuse. Si on progresse un peu plus dans le dispositif, nous acheminons lentement vers l'ordinateur, plus exactement vers le terminal d'ordinateur Télétel, qui est une pièce essentielle de toute cette manifestation, dans la mesure où cet outil de la technologie avancée va nous permettre de constituer une banque de l'imaginaire avec tous les faits divers qui nous sont arrivés par toutes les voies, aussi bien par le téléphone, aussi bien que par les participations ici présentes, enfin par voie postale. Pour en arriver ici, à la cotation du fait divers du jour, qui a lieu selon le rituel habituel de la bourse.
The press conference involved a daily radio broadcast that offered critical and humorous commentary on the pirated content of French news and opinion programming. Forrest worked with a fringe FM radio station, his own team of young journalists, and a series of special guests that included intellectuals like Abraham Moles, government ministers, opposition politicians, and an advertising mogul. The makeshift broadcast studio was set up in an exhibition space that it shared with a multimedia installation featuring a conference table surrounded by video monitors playing the recorded speeches of famous world leaders, and a database of more speeches in the form of alphabet macaroni. Whether they were conspicuously devoid of meaningful information or transmitted original content via alternative channels, Forrest metacommunicational projects were always predicated on the disruption of business as usual in the media through interruption, hijacking, parody, substitution, workarounds, and other methods. Learn how to watch television by listening to the radio, and Watchtowers of Peace also raised fundamental issues of time and space in the modern mediascape. For instance, Watchtowers involved the broadcasting of private messages of peace into the war-torn former Yugoslavia via jerry-rigged towers on the border and other means, and also offered an alternative to the exotic and spectacular treatment of space and time in 24-hour television news that promises to bring the world into your living room and allow you to witness events as they happen.
Message pour vous demander d'arrêter cette guerre stupide, idiote.
Au départ, l'idée est totalement folle. Installer des haut-parleurs à la frontière entre l'Autriche et l'ex-Yougoslavie pour lancer des messages de paix vers ces collines de Slovénie, de Croatie et peut-être même au-delà, vers la Bosnie. Une idée ouverte au monde entier puisqu'il suffit de téléphoner à l'un de ces numéros pour envoyer en direct des ondes de paix. C'est dingue, peut-être inutile, mais Fred Forrest, artiste révolté contre la guerre, l'a pourtant osé.
Learn How to Watch TV used a confederation of independent radio stations to broadcast alternative audio to go with the official visual content of French television programming after viewers had turned down the volume on their sets. Broadcast from a mobile studio in front of the Grand Palais in Paris, the alternative audio was alternately critical, philosophical, humorous, and nonsensical. Forrest described the operation as similar to the unexpected technical difficulties that often send viewers into a panic because they don't know what to do to fill the time they were going to spend watching TV. Forrest's project was a timeout from TV as usual. Time is recovered and given back to the viewers to be used in ways that are more satisfying, amusing, or mindful. Learn How to Watch TV is also an exercise in using media to create a communal event that is markedly different from the made-for-TV events of the Society of the Spectacle.
Vendredi 19 octobre, installez-vous à égale distance entre votre téléviseur et votre poste FM. Fred Forrest et 10 radios libres, dans le cadre de la Foire internationale d'art contemporain, vous proposent une émission non-stop de 19 à 22 heures depuis le parvis du Grand Palais à Paris.
It's easy to understand the appeal of the Internet to someone like Fred Forrest. Its built-in multimedia and interactive capacities, its decentralized structure and democratic ethos, the opportunity it offers artists to circumvent art institutions and appeal directly to a broader public, its transformative impact on society and daily life, and the mythical aura of cyberspace all touch on major themes in his previous work. However, Forrest does not view the Internet in naive utopian terms, or exaggeratedly dystopian ones. It's neither the ideal infrastructure of Teilhard's noosphere, nor the stage on which Virilio's dromosphere turns catastrophic. It is part of a new layer of reality that art is called upon to help us understand. A pioneer of net art in France, Forrest's first project with an online component was From Casablanca to Locarno, which included email as one of the means by which the viewers of a live television broadcast could submit alternative dialogue for the 1942 Humphrey Bogart Ingrid Bergman classic. Many of his subsequent online projects took on a distinctly ritual and liminal quality. What is liminality? According to the anthropologist Victor Turner, it's the playful and speculative subjunctive mood of social behavior. It occurs when individuals or societies on the threshold of major changes engage in a more intense, interpersonal, and free-flowing form of collective public performance, during which societal norms are temporarily suspended or undermined, and new ones may be imagined. Examples include traditional rites of passage, the subversive and deviant spectacle of carnival as described by Bakhtin, and more theatrical types of political protest rallies. There has been a ritual and liminal element in Forrest's work dating back to the 1970s. However, his experiments in net art have made a priority of bringing this element to public performance online and using it as a tool to help people lead more meaningful lives in their hybrid cyber-social environment. I first discovered Fred's work while conducting research on France's inaugural Internet Day celebration, or Fête de l'Internet, in 1998. Although largely a private initiative, the annual celebration was patterned after the Fête de la Musique, launched by the Socialist Minister of Culture Jacques Lang in 1982. It also corresponded to the objectives of the French government's technology policy, which included staking out a French exception in cyberspace, which the Prime Minister at the time, Lionel Jospin, also a socialist, described in terms of preserving solidarity in a digital information society. I was intrigued to discover that a happening created by an artist named Fred Forrest was to be one of the headline events of the celebration. This was J'arrête le temps, or Time Out. The basic premise of the project was to suspend time in cyberspace, in other words, on the project website, for a 24-hour duration between 12 and 12:59 p.m., using a series of synchronized webcam feeds from the world's different time zones. Just as the clock was about to strike 1 o'clock, the interface switched to the live feed of a webcam one time zone to the west. Forrest offered participants various thoughtful and amusing ways to pass the time during the symbolic stoppage. Those in need of a vacation could send a scanned image of their feet to an electronic address hosted on a server in Guadeloupe, where they could bask in the sun during a relaxing day-long getaway. Those in need of more time could purchase it online in different increments for use at a later date, whenever and for whatever purpose they desired. In my view, Fred's project was an example of true liminal festivity online. It was a ritual pause in the everyday urgent regime of time, which technology normally tends to intensify, an opportunity for people to come together in one place, albeit virtual, and playfully reflect on some of the changing paradigms that structured their lives, while taking part in a virtual public procession around the world. For the second edition of the Internet Day celebration, Forrest got married to fellow artist Sophie Laveau. Forrest and Laveau turned their civil ceremony into a live and online performance, in which the public not in attendance at the town hall could participate via the internet by watching the live feed of the ceremony, sending congratulatory wishes or flowers, or signing up for something on the couple's gift registry, all online. The event's main feature was a simultaneous virtual reality version of the ceremony, generated in real time based on input from motion sensors worn by the bride and groom, a marriage of the real and the virtual, as well as of two people in love.
Monsieur Forrest Claude Alfred, consentez-vous à prendre pour épouse Mademoiselle Laveau Sophie Michel, ici présente?
Oui.
Mademoiselle Laveau Sophie Michel, consentez-vous à prendre pour époux Monsieur Forrest Claude Alfred, ici présent?
Oui.
En vertu des pouvoirs qui nous sont conférés, nous déclarons au nom de la loi qu'unis par le mariage.
The Center of the World, also from 1999, is one of my favorite projects from Forrest's early experiments in net art. Its premise is a pilgrimage to the center of the world, enshrined at a sanctuary-like installation space in Paris. If one couldn't make the trip in person physically, one could do so virtually, thanks to the live webcam feed on the project's website. In reality, the center in question was a digital relic, housed in a structure which Forrest likened to a well, but which was clearly an altar. The setup suggested that the old notion of a physically, geopolitically, and culturally centered world was defunct in a technotronic age of globalization and deterritorialization. If there were still a center, it was none other than one's personal computer screen, now replaced by the smartphone screen each one of us carries in his hand wherever he goes. The potentially disorienting aspects of this cultural mutation were mitigated somewhat by Forrest's use of digital technologies to restore a poetic sense of space, spiritual itinerary, journey, and discovery. Ebb and Flow, the Internet Cave, is Forrest's reinterpretation of Plato's famous allegory of the cave from Book 7 of the Republic. In Forrest's version, the shadows encountered on the wall of the cave included one's own silhouette, along with media content displayed on an array of screens deployed in the crypt-like space. The silhouettes, which also bore a luminous resemblance to Yves Klein's dancing and languorous anthropometrie, suggested that in modern life on the screen, as Sherry Turkle calls it, we might all be living a large share of our lives as digital avatars instead of as real flesh and blood people. One of the overarching themes of Forrest's work is territory. Forrest's territories are utopian enclaves of free expression, social interaction, imagination, lucidity, and independent modes of communication, carved out of the status quo. They are reminiscent of Michel de Certeau's analogy of poachers and trespassers who maneuver artfully in the proprietary spaces of cities and culture, which are shaped by and for the powerful. Better still, we can think of them as examples of Hakim Bey's temporary autonomous zones. Forrest's first utopian territories were quite tiny in size. The small, parasitical blank spaces he inserted in the mass media. The most famous iteration was 150 square centimeters of newspaper in the pages of Le Monde in 1972, part of the Space Media Project. Once again, the underlying principle was rather simple. The small blank square was a breach of Zen-like emptiness and potential interactivity in a static medium filled with the authoritative words and paid advertising of the political, intellectual, and business elites. In the caption below the blank space, Forrest addressed the newspaper's readers, asking them to fill in the space with content of their own making and to send him their submissions by mail. The readers' submissions varied greatly in form and in tone. There were doodles, cartoons, political statements, poetry, serious works of art in miniature, visual and verbal jokes, personal snapshots, collages of material cut from other publications, and even denunciations of Forrest and what some perceived as a publicity stunt, an attempt at manipulation on his part. The results were exhibited together at a salon of painting at the Grand Palais. The project was a prescient experiment in what would later be called social media. Blank space was also a central component in Forrest's attempt to create a temporary autonomous zone of free expression in conjunction with the 1973 Biennale de São Paulo. This large-scale operation, which tested the tolerance of the military regime, involved an installation at the Biennale itself, various interventions in the local and national media, and events in the street. The most important of the latter was The City Invaded by Blank Space, a mock street demonstration in which the marchers carried blank signs. These blank signs were perhaps more dangerous than if they had had political slogans. They were poignant symbols of both state censorship and the pure potential of free expression and dissent. Occupying a middle ground between art and activism, they made the government's response more complicated, especially since the Avant-Garde Biennale was a way for the regime to show that it had evolved since the early days of the junta in the 1960s. Ultimately, Forrest's installation was shut down and he was taken into custody. Variations on this fill-in-the-blank concept have been used throughout Forrest's career. One example was a press intervention that asked readers to create pictures of their dream house. Another one asked them to imagine the conversation between the two young women in David's Portrait of Zénaïde and Charlotte Bonaparte. His blank spaces took on a concretely territorial form with the artistic square meter in 1977. Wanting to demonstrate the similar role that publicity played in the speculative practices of the art and real estate markets, Forrest created his own real estate promotion company and set out to sell square meter parcels of undeveloped land in the country near France's border with Switzerland. The professional-looking advertisements for the operation stressed the artistic nature of the tiny plots, the first of which was to be sold at an art auction. Forrest's operation attracted the attention of both the police, who suspected real estate fraud and false advertising, and the Professional Order of Notaries, who objected to a real estate transaction being handled by an art auctioneer, and the sale was banned in its original form by the Public Prosecutor's Office. At the last minute, Forrest auctioned off a substitute item, a piece of cheap fabric measuring 1 square meter in area. It fetched a rather high price, which only served to confirm Forrest's point about publicity, speculation, and the value of art and real estate. Subsequently, the artistic square meter, that is to say, the piece of fabric, the performance, the media intervention, the concept, and the land itself, was officially declared a work of art by Pierre Estienne. As a means to further develop the territorial dimension of the artistic square meter concept, without the interference of the authorities, Forrest founded the Territory of the Square Meter as an independent and sovereign artistic state within France in 1980. The site of the breakaway state was Forrest's property in Ancerville, 50 kilometers northwest of Paris. The seat of government was the renovated 18th century stable where Forrest himself lived. Individuals and organizations could become citizens of the territory by purchasing a subscription to a square meter section of the grounds, a brilliant example of what the art historian Craig Saper calls the intimate bureaucracy genre. The territory was both a parody of a political entity and a functioning imaginary community in game mode. It had its constitution, president for life, administrative structures, official communiques, public works projects, civic gatherings, and foreign policy. The ground floor of the building was converted into Forrest's ironic and fanciful idea of a presidential palace. Taken by themselves, the various installations and objects displayed in this seat of government constitute a comprehensive artwork in the tradition of Postman Cheval's ideal palace, Kurt Schwitter's Merzbau, Ben Vautier's record shop in Nice, and Marcel Brutard's Museum of Modern Art, Department of Eagles.
Ça, c'est une position importante dans le dispositif territoire, parce que cette fenêtre est le lieu de passage entre la réalité ici, qui relève de la fiction, de l'imaginaire, et la réalité physique avec les mètres carrés au sol, qui représente la réalité. Voilà.
The territory was always a virtual entity as much as a real one. However, after he began creating projects online, Forrest started to experiment with ways to make it more explicitly virtual. Network Territory offered a means to explore the site and history of the territory in Ancerville through a hypertext narrative that also offered a fanciful account of Forrest's life and career. Territorial outings involved a square meter of cyberspace on the floor of a suburban megastore near the checkout lanes, where it was trod upon daily by hundreds of shoppers and filmed in real time via webcam. It was an attempt to raise awareness of the different types of non-places that people frequent and inhabit on a daily basis, from the drab and incoherent suburbs to bustling hubs of consumer culture. It also alluded to the increasing interpenetration of the real and the virtual in everyday life, from the sprawling Internet of Things to the digital footprint we leave in cyberspace every time we use a bank card to pay for something. The virtualization of the territory reached a climax in 2008, when Forrest created an outpost of the territory in the online environment of Second Life. The Second Life version of the territory was often modified to mimic real-world locations where Forrest's artistic actions took place. The focal point of the SL territory was its experimental research center, an adjacent grid of interactive square-meter parcels. The research center is a reflection of the idea dating back to sociological art, that art is a special form of social research. Arguably, the most successful of Forrest's Second Life-based operations was the Traders' Ball in 2010, a reflection on the global financial crisis of 2008, and inspired by the Occupy Wall Street movement. It featured an installation at the Lab Gallery in Midtown Manhattan and a simultaneous live dance party for avatars in the Second Life territory. The appropriately hollow, boogieing mannequins of the in situ ball were an indictment of the greedy and irresponsible traders who treated the global financial market as a high-stakes computer game and could keep on partying in style even after they had bankrupted the pension plans of workers and drove ordinary people from their over-mortgaged homes. The ball was also reminiscent of the medieval motif of the Danse Macabre, except that the living dead never came at the end to spoil the party and drag the movers and shakers of high finance into the netherworld. In retrospect, virtually all of Fred's work can be considered part of the territory. From the blank spaces in the pages of Le Monde to the electromagnetic waves of international Klein blue pulsing through the ether in Italy. From the Rue Guénégaud in Paris to the digital street corner in Miami Beach. And from the center of the world to the halls of power in Ancerville. The Greater Territory is one of the most striking manifestations of utopia in contemporary art.
Yet, in a number of ways, Forrest's notion of utopia goes against the grain of the traditional utopian paradigm involving representations of the ideal society projected in imaginary settings. To begin with, his utopia is as much a point of departure as a final destination or objective. That point of departure is the abstract and artificial environment in which modern communication takes place, the pseudo-public arena that Baudrillard described sarcastically as the fully realized utopia of the ecstasy of communication. Forrest's objective is the fundamentally realistic one of helping people understand what this simultaneously virtual and real environment really is and means, not to posit it as an ideal. Secondly, while there is certainly a lot of interesting imagery in Forrest's work, it's not primarily about visual or conceptual representation. Rather, it's about functional operation and only results in art through the public's interaction with and through the special interfaces he sets up. Finally, Forrest's projects often undermine our usual utopian expectations about communication and technology through their not infrequent malfunctions, their slipshod do-it-yourself construction, their frustrating lack
of coherent messages and their deeply ironic tone.
So what then is one to think of the retrospective of Forrest's work held at the Centre Pompidou in the summer of 2017? Forrest can speak for himself concerning his grievances against the center, and has done so forcefully and persuasively. But there was also much to like in the exhibition. It did a good job of presenting Forrest's pioneering achievements in video, media, and telecom art, although it almost completely left out his experiments in net art after 1995. It also highlighted the subtle beauty of the content and artifacts associated with many of his actions, the results of a refined aesthetic sensibility often overlooked by critics. Above all, it correctly focused on the notion of territory as the unifying principle of much of his work, which it divided into 5 thematic and chronological categories. These were 1. Fred Forrest, the painter; 2. Leaps into the void; 3. Local and planetary territories; 4. Institutional territory; and 5. The territory of the square meter. While Forrest has raised questions about his retrospectives having been relegated to the basement level of the center, which is not as prestigious and visible as the top floor traditionally reserved for major exhibitions of this type, this could also be seen as an advantage. Access to the basement level is free of charge, which made his retrospective more democratic, something that corresponds quite well to the spirit of sociological art. There was, however, a more basic problem. The retrospective betrayed the spirit of the territory, and couldn't do otherwise, given its institutional logic. Forrest's territory is not something that can be pinned down, put on display on walls and under glass, and reconfigured so as to conform neatly to the categories of art history. It's an unstable entity that only exists fleetingly and episodically via the active participation of its citizens and undocumented foreigners. Above all, it is a rebel enclave, forever unsubdued and refractory. Forrest sensed rightly that the retrospective represented an attempt to colonize the territory, to make it part of the empire of art. So he resisted. He resisted first by staging 2 unruly and eccentric participatory events in the territorial exhibition space at the Pompidou Center. He continued to resist by criticizing the center relentlessly in social media, both during and after the exhibition. And he resists today through his counter-exhibition at the White Box. Ironically, this resistance actually does the center and his public a favor by giving his retrospective a true taste of the territory.
And so the fight continues. With Fred Forrest, this is the only way that things could ever be. The territory lives on as a fiercely independent entity. And Forrest, the artist who wants to be an interface, the way Andy Warhol wanted to be a machine, will not keep quiet or sit still. Fight on, Fred, and may the Force be with you.